Miles won Le Mans. Not technically, not on paper, not according to the French officials who read a rulebook nobody had bothered to explain beforehand. But he won it. He was faster, he was dominant, and he was denied. And then 2 months later, he climbed into a car that had already killed someone, drove it down a California backstretch at over 200 miles per hour, and never came back. Hollywood gave him Christian Bale and a redemption arc. What Hollywood didn't give him was the truth. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, where we go past the movie poster, past the studio notes, and into the actual history that the film industry keeps leaving on the cutting room floor. Who Ken Miles actually was. The film introduces Ken Miles as a hot-headed British mechanic running a struggling shop in North Hollywood, throwing wrenches at customers, barely keeping the lights on, and possessed of a driving talent so raw and obvious that Carroll Shelby can spot it from 50 yards. It's a great character entrance. It's also only half the story. Kenneth Henry Miles was born on November 1st, 1918, in Sutton Coldfield, a town just north of Birmingham in England. He left school at 15 and went to work as an apprentice at Wolseley Motors. So far, so Hollywood. But here is where the film's version of Miles quietly parts ways with the historical record, and the divergence matters enormously. Before Miles ever sat in a racing car, before he ever turned a wrench for Carroll Shelby, before he ever set foot on American soil, he spent the Second World War commanding tanks in some of the worst fighting Western Europe produced. And I mean commanding, not driving, not riding along, not keeping the engine warm in a depot somewhere in England. Miles's first military role was as a driving instructor in the Territorial Army. On October 1st, 1942, he became one of the founding members of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the REME, an elite corps responsible for keeping Britain's armored vehicles operational under combat conditions. He was posted to the Guards Armored Division, then the 29th Armored Brigade. He landed in Normandy on June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, and ended the war as a staff sergeant and tank commander. Think carefully about what that experience actually produces in a person. This wasn't a man who developed a feel for machinery by tinkering in a garage on weekends. Miles commanded armored vehicles through some of the most mechanically and psychologically demanding conditions in human history. His job was to understand every component, every stress threshold, every failure point of machines that were, quite literally, the difference between his men living and dying. He made split-second decisions about mechanical systems at speed, under fire, with lives depending on his judgment. When Miles later told Ford engineers that their GT40 was dangerous, he wasn't guessing. He wasn't being difficult. He wasn't performing the hot-headed genius act that the film implies. He was a man who had spent years keeping armored vehicles together under conditions that destroyed lesser machines and lesser men. And he knew exactly what a vehicle at its limits felt like from the inside. The film gives us the eccentricity, the Brummy accent, the flying wrenches, the spectacular stubbornness. What it quietly removes is the bedrock seriousness underneath the personality. And that seriousness is the thing that made Miles irreplaceable, not just as a driver, but as the man who developed the GT40 from a dangerous liability into a car that could win Le Mans 4 years running. The hothead myth. Here is the central creative decision Ford versus Ferrari makes about Ken Miles, and I understand why they made it, even as I'm going to argue it costs the film something real. The film portrays Miles as an explosive, confrontational outsider, threatening officials, punching Carroll Shelby in the face for fun, constantly at war with the corporate machinery around him. It makes for tremendous cinema. It also doesn't match what the people who actually knew Ken Miles have to say about him. Miles had a reputation on the West Coast racing circuit for courtesy. He was sometimes called the Sterling Moss of the West Coast. And for people who don't follow racing history, Sterling Moss was regarded as the cleanest, fairest competitor of his generation, a man as famous for his sportsmanship as for his speed. Miles was regarded as a clean, fair competitor who had an exceptional feel for a car's limits, a quality that prevented him from making contact with other drivers even in the most aggressive racing situations. Carroll Shelby himself, in a biography of Miles published in 2004, described him in terms that don't match the Hollywood version at all. Shelby called Miles the best test driver he ever knew and said he was helpful to other drivers. He reminded me of Fangio in that regard. He would take time to teach the other drivers. And then there's this, which is the quote that stops me every time I read it. Miles described himself this way: "I am a mechanic. That has been the direction of my entire vocational life. Driving is a hobby, a relaxation for me, like golfing is to others." Read that again. A hobby, like golfing. This is a man who drove at Le Mans, describing racing as his hobby the way an accountant might describe weekend fishing. That is not the portrait of a glory-hungry, combustible racer straining against the corporate leash. That is the portrait of a deeply intelligent, sardonic, self-aware professional who happened to also be one of the fastest drivers on the planet. The film exaggerated Miles's volatility because volatility creates dramatic tension. Carroll Shelby needing to manage a brilliant, difficult driver is a better story engine than Carroll Shelby working alongside a disciplined, courteous professional who happened to disagree with Ford's management on technical grounds. I get it, I do. But in smoothing Miles into a recognizable archetype, the tortured genius, the combustible outsider, the film accidentally diminishes what made him extraordinary. His emotional discipline was as remarkable as his mechanical genius. Hollywood traded one for the other. The corporate villain problem, Ford versus Ferrari, needs a villain. Every good story does. And the film casts Josh Lucas's Leo Beebe as the primary antagonist, the corporate suit who doesn't understand racing, doesn't understand Miles, and exists largely to obstruct everything Shelby and Miles are trying to accomplish. Lucas plays it with such oily conviction that you genuinely want to throw something at the screen every time he appears, which, I'll be honest, is exactly what he's there for. The historical Leo Beebe was more complicated. He was Ford's director of special vehicles, and he absolutely was resistant to Miles. But his resistance wasn't cartoonish corporate jealousy. Beebe had legitimate concerns about Miles's public image and whether a driver with Miles's reputation for bluntness would be a liability for Ford's marketing operation. That's not villainy. That's a marketing executive doing his job, badly and wrongly in this case, but doing it. More importantly, the film implies that Beebe was a lone obstacle that Shelby was constantly fighting. The reality is that Ford's racing program involved hundreds of people across multiple continents, and the corporate interference the film condenses into Beebe was actually spread across a much larger organization. The Advanced Vehicles Division in England, the Holman and Moody team, the various Ford executives who had opinions about Le Mans strategy, all of it gets collapsed into one man in a suit. The danger of the cartoon villain is that it lets the real story off the hook, because the real story isn't about one bad man making bad decisions. It's about an institutional culture at Ford that prioritized marketing narratives over sporting merit, and that culture didn't have one face. It had hundreds of faces, and most of them thought they were doing the right thing. That's a much harder story to tell, and frankly a much more unsettling one, which is probably why the film didn't tell it. What the film skips entirely, Ford versus Ferrari opens its racing narrative with the 1965 Le Mans, presenting it as Ford's disastrous debut at the race. 7 cars entered, none finished. Carroll Shelby watches the wreckage. Ken Miles sits at home in California, listening on the radio, dancing with his wife. Here's the problem. Ford's actual Le Mans debut was in 1964, a full year earlier. And it was also a disaster. And Ken Miles was not dancing with his wife in California during the 1965 race. He was in France, driving for Ford, setting lap records before his car's gearbox failed. The film collapses 2 years of catastrophic failure into one for narrative economy, which I understand. But the omission hides something important about Miles specifically. He was there in 1965. He experienced the failure firsthand. He drove that broken car. And then he came back in 1966 and drove the fixed version to one of the most dominant performances in Le Mans history. That's a different and more powerful arc than the one the film presents. A man who failed at Le Mans twice, who knew exactly how brutal and unforgiving that race was, who had felt the gearbox die under him on the Mulsanne Straight, and who came back a third time and was faster than everyone else on the planet. The film's version of Miles arrives at Le Mans relatively fresh. The real Miles arrived knowing precisely what it could take from him. and he climbed in anyway. The Triple Crown, nobody talks about. This is the chapter I most want people to understand because I think it's the biggest single omission in Ford versus Ferrari, and it changes everything about the emotional weight of that photo finish. No driver has ever won the 24 hours of Daytona, or the 12 hours of Sebring, and the 24 hours of Le Mans in the same calendar year. Not Andretti, not Alonso, not any driver in the 60 years since Ken Miles came within a few hundred meters of doing it. As of today, that feat, the endurance racing Triple Crown in a single season, remains the most elusive achievement in motorsport, the empty trophy shelf that no one has managed to fill. In 1966, Ken Miles won Daytona. He won Sebring, and then he arrived at Le Mans, leading the race, on pace to lap every car on the circuit except his Ford teammates, carrying the possibility of something that had never been done in the history of motorsport and that no one has managed since. The film shows the photo finish as a disappointing end to a race Miles should have won, and that's true as far as it goes. But it fundamentally undersells what was actually on the table. This wasn't just a Le Mans win. This was an unrepeatable moment in sporting history, a record that, once set, would have stood forever. The kind of achievement that defines not just a career, but the entire history of a sport. Charlie Agapiu, a Shelby mechanic who was there that day, was blunt about what he saw happening in Ford's management conversations. Ford didn't want Ken to win at Le Mans. They wanted the headlines to read, "Ford wins Le Mans, not Miles becomes the first to sweep Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans." Let that sit for a moment. Ford's marketing department looked at the possibility of the greatest individual achievement in endurance racing history and decided it was less useful to them than a corporate headline. They traded a moment that would have lived forever for a press release. And Ken Miles, the man who had spent 2 years helping develop the car from the ground up, who had survived Normandy and 2 Le Mans failures and a gearbox that died on the Mulsanne, paid the price for that calculation. The photo finish. What really happened? Ford versus Ferrari handles the photo finish with genuine emotional intelligence. Shelby delivers the order reluctantly. Miles accepts it with quiet dignity. It's one of the best scenes in the movie. It's also only partially true. Shelby mechanic John Collins recalled what actually happened at that final pit stop. After Carroll talked to Ken, Collins heard Miles say in a loud voice, "So ends my contribution to this bloody motor race." Then he threw his sunglasses across the pit. That's the real Ken Miles, not stoic, furious, but containing that fury the only way a professional could, by honoring the order while making absolutely clear what it was costing him. The film makes it cleaner. The reality was raw. Now, here's what actually haunts me about this story. The film puts the photo finish decision squarely on Leo Beebe, the corporate villain in the suit, and Beebe was involved. But Carroll Shelby's own account tells a completely different story. In 1966, Ford didn't cost Ken Miles the race at Le Mans. I did, and I regret it to this day. Leo Beebe asked me who I thought should win. I asked him what he thought. He said he'd kinda like to see all 3 cars cross together. So I said, let's do it that way. Not knowing the French would interpret the rules the way they did. There's your real story. No mustache-twirling villain. Just 2 men having a casual conversation in a pit lane, both thinking they were doing the right thing, and the greatest driver of his generation paying the price for it. That's more devastating than anything Josh Lucas could deliver on screen, because there's nobody to be angry at. Just a terrible, ordinary mistake with permanent consequences. Miles's public statement afterward was the most heartbreaking kind of professionalism. He said he considered they had won, but were placed second by a technicality, and that the responsibility rested with Ford's decision to make it a dead heat. Over his protests. Then he added the line that floors me every time. Please be careful how you report what I have said. I work for these people. They have been awfully good to me. A man who just had history stolen from him, protecting the people who stole it. That's not the hot-headed outsider the film gave us. That's something much harder to reckon with. The death Hollywood got wrong. 2 months after Le Mans, August 17th, 1966, Riverside International Raceway, California. The film shows Miles dying in a fire. It's a shocking, sudden sequence, and it communicates the basic facts. Miles was killed testing an experimental Ford prototype, while getting the actual circumstances significantly wrong. And the actual circumstances matter because they tell you something important about what really happened to Ken Miles and why. The car Miles was testing was the Ford J car. It was intended to be the successor to the GT40 Mark II, featuring an experimental camback aerodynamic design. Essentially a bread loaf-shaped rear section that Ford's engineers were excited about as the next step in prototype development. Lighter, potentially faster, the future of the program. Here is what Ford versus Ferrari doesn't tell you. The J car had already killed someone before Miles ever got in it. Walt Hansgen was a 4-time SCCA road racing champion, a Formula One point scorer, and one of the most respected drivers in America. He was killed testing a Ford GT40 at the Le Mans test weekend in April of 1966. 4 months before Miles's accident, his car aquaplaned in the rain. He tried to steer toward an escape road and found a barrier that hadn't been there on his earlier laps. He never regained consciousness. He died 4 days later. After Hansgen's death, Ford shelved the J-car program. The dangerous prototype sat in a garage while engineers tried to understand what had gone wrong. And then, 4 months later, they resumed testing, with Ken Miles at the wheel. On the final lap of his test session, there was nothing to indicate anything was wrong, as the car came down the backstretch at approximately 175 miles per hour. Then, toward the end of the straight, when the car had slowed to approximately 100 miles per hour, it went out of control, spun to the inside of the course, and went over a tall embankment. The car bounded end over end. Miles was thrown from the car and was dead of head injuries before emergency crews reached the scene. The fire that followed destroyed most of the physical evidence. The exact cause was never officially determined, but in the decades since, the physics have become considerably clearer. After the crash, the aerodynamics of the J car were substantially modified to correct a specific problem: rear-end lift generated at race speeds. The breadloaf camback design that Ford's engineers were so excited about was, at certain speeds, behaving like an aircraft wing, generating lift underneath the rear of the car. At over 200 miles per hour on a downhill straight in hot California desert air, the rear of that car was fighting against the road, and at some point, it won. James T. Crow, writing in Road and Track in November of 1966, said, "What everyone who had watched Miles drive already knew. No one who knew Ken's driving can believe that the accident resulted from a mistake on his part. Ken Miles didn't crash that car. The car crashed him, and the evidence that might have proven it burned before anyone could collect it." Miles's son Peter was 15 years old. He was at Riverside that day with his mother. He watched his father die. He has not been back to Le Mans since. Cool. What Miles left behind? Here's the detail that Ford versus Ferrari omits entirely, and it's the one that reframes everything. After Miles's death, Ford executives mandated that a roll cage similar to those used in NASCAR Grand National Competition be installed in future versions of the J car. The significantly revised prototype was renamed the Ford Mark IV, and that roll cage, mandated specifically because of what happened to Ken Miles, almost certainly saved Mario Andretti's life at Le Mans in 1967, when Andretti had a massive accident and walked away from it. Steel roll cages became standardized in prototype sports car racing following Miles's accident. The safety improvement has protected drivers ever since. The Mark IV that won Le Mans in 1967 was built on the lessons of Miles's death. He made it possible from beyond the grave. The endurance racing Triple Crown, Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans in a single year remains unclaimed. 60 years of trying, every generation of motorsport's greatest drivers, and the shelf Miles almost filled, is still empty. It is the most elusive individual achievement in endurance racing, and it will always carry his name in the margins of the record books, listed as the man who came closest. Miles was posthumously inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2001, 35 years after his death. For 3.5 decades, the man Carroll Shelby called the backbone of Ford's entire Le Mans program was remembered only by the people who had been there. Molly Miles, his widow, wrote to Road and Track in November of 1966. Sometimes controversial, sometimes turbulent, but we have been happy. That's not the portrait of a tortured obsessive. That's a man who had built a life he loved with people he loved, doing work that genuinely fulfilled him. And it was taken from him by a car that shouldn't have been running that day, on a track where the evidence burned before anyone could find the truth. Ford versus Ferrari is a great film. Christian Bale's performance is extraordinary. And without that film, most people outside hardcore racing circles would never have heard Ken Miles's name. That matters. That genuinely matters. But the real Ken Miles, the tank commander, the disciplined professional, the man who called racing his hobby like golfing, the man who threw his sunglasses across a pit lane and then climbed back in the car, that man is more interesting than the one Hollywood put on screen. Carroll Shelby said it best, and he said it for the rest of his life. We have nobody to take his place. Nobody. He was our baseline, our guiding point. He was the backbone of our program. There will never be another Ken Miles. He was right. There wasn't. There still isn't. And 60 years later, the trophy shelf is still empty.